Welcome to the school. This is the first beginning of the term for all of us. We're particularly pleased to see you here now because of the very interesting exhibition we have out in the hallway. I hope you all had a chance to take a look at the Larry Fink photographs before you came in. Our curator, Kate Summers, has been working with us for several years now to try to mount exhibitions that reflect some of the kinds of issues that we worry about and teach about here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And inequality, of course, is one of the most important of those issues. I think it's a particularly interesting and thoughtful set of images that Kate has up from Larry Fink. So if you didn't see it before, please do take a good look afterwards. We've got a bunch of local experts, and not only some of our leading social scientists at the university, but some of the best teachers. So I think it'll be a particularly good panel this afternoon. I'm going to introduce them all at first and really very briefly because I think you probably have heard all of them speak before. We're going to go in alphabetical order. So Alan Krueger will be first. Alan is a professor of economics and public affairs, and has been working. He's a labor economist who has worked on a wide variety of different kinds of real-life problems. Our economists don't always work on problems that strike me as real-life problems, but Alan does, and he has a particularly lucid and compelling way of talking to general audiences about them. So Alan will lead off. And then Doug Massey, about whom exactly the same thing could be said, will go next. Doug is a professor of sociology and public affairs. He works both in urban sociology. He's also a leading expert on immigration. And about a year ago, he published an absolutely fascinating book on structural inequality, and I imagine he's going to talk to you about that today. And the third but not least speaker is going to be Viviana Zelizer, who is a professor in the sociology department here, and one of the creators of a new field in sociology, economic sociology. She has written very widely in the field and has given us new ways to understand how social organization relates to economic structure. So we've got three rather different takes on the problem here today. And I think it should be an absolutely fascinating discussion. So I'm just going to turn over to Alan.
Thanks, Dan. I think this is the first time I've been asked to speak because of photographs, which I have to say I enjoyed or found informative when I looked at. I don't know if enjoy is quite the right word given the subject. What I thought I would do today is review some slides that I prepared over the summer. I prepared them first because I was asked to be on a task force for Hillary Clinton on job growth and job quality. Then at the end of the summer, I was invited to give a briefing to Senator Obama on the same subject. So I used the same set of slides. And you'll see some of them actually out in the hallway as well. The New York Times described my role as a floater, which not the first word that would come to my mind, but I'm happy to advise any serious candidate for president who wants my advice. So the U.S. has really had a remarkable shift when it comes to inequality, probably the most dramatic economic development of my lifetime. And this figure shows, I'm going to show you lots of different takes on this, how inequality has been rising, which dimensions, and then I'll say a little bit about explanations. So this shows you from 1947 to 1973. When I worked in the Labor Department, we used to call this chart growing together, growing apart. And you could see by each quintile of the income distribution, the family income distribution, percentage growth in income from 47 to 73, and then from 1973 to 2005. In the later period, you see rising inequality. The top fifth has grown substantially more than the bottom fifth. This converts the figures into per annum growth rates to make them comparable. And the top 5% has done even better. This is based on data from the current population survey, household survey. It's difficult to survey the very wealthy. This next chart shows you the share of income going to the top 1% of families. And this is based on tax data. And you could see that the top 1% has increased its share of national income considerably since the early 70s, from 8% up to around 18% of national income. We're back to about where we were in the 1920s. And that was following a period that was known as the Great Compression, when inequality fell in the United States. This shows you percentile by percentile. And there's kind of a fractal quality to the rise in wage inequality over this whole time period. However you cut it, you seem to see rising inequality, with a couple of exceptions. And one of the exceptions is actually the top line. So the top line is women. The bottom line shows you for men. So this shows you, looking at the, say, 10th percentile of the distribution of wages in 1963, and then the same percentile, the 10th percentile in 2005, how much growth was there in the wage rate at that percentile. And the fact that these lines are both upward sloping says that the higher percentiles are experiencing faster wage growth. Women at each percentile were experiencing faster wage growth than men. Women on average earn less than men. That gap has shrunk. So that's one dimension in which inequality has not increased over this whole time period. But within women and within men, we see a pretty dramatic rise in inequality. And furthermore, it's the case that wage inequality, the growth in wage inequality, is responsible for most of the growth in family income inequality that I showed you earlier, which is why I think it's important to have a labor economist on this panel to focus on what it is in the labor market that's driving up wage inequality. This just shows you another take, and there really have been two periods, one the 80s and the other since the late 80s, where the nature of the rise in inequality has changed. Over both of these periods, the very top has been doing the best. So this shows you wage growth at the 90th percentile, the 70th, the 50th, the 20th, the 30th, kind of the broad middle, and then the 10th percentile. And what you can see is from 1979 to 1989, the bottom 10% were losing 1.5% of real pay a year. A really remarkable period of decline. Now that reversed itself in the 1990s, and in particular in the late 1990s when the economy was very strong and when the minimum wage increased. The bottom actually did relatively well, better than the middle. And you can see that since the early 90s, the middle has been the slowest growth segment of the workforce. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in the late 1990s where I called this the problem of the sagging middle. And in many respects, when it comes to policy, the weaker growth for middle income earners is a much more challenging problem than is the decline at the bottom, because it doesn't take that much income to transfer to make the bottom better off. It takes an enormous amount of transfers to make the middle better off beyond what I would say our political system is capable of. And you can see over this whole period, the top has done well, has had the strongest growth. By historical standards, the top was not growing exceptionally fast, but what was different is that the top was growing at a much faster rate than the middle and the bottom. Now, much of the rise, I'll skip over that one, much of the rise in inequality can be traced to differences in education. And I'll show you a little bit more on this, but this shows you median earnings by education level, and at the very top are those with a professional degree, a law degree, or a medical degree, then a doctoral degree, then a master's degree, like from the Woodrow Wilson School, then a bachelor's degree, and so on. So you can see that there's a very strong relationship between education and median earnings. And from best we can tell from studying identical twins or looking at compulsory schooling changes, it looks like the extra education is quite valuable for people. People who get more education on average tend to earn more. Now that's become much more true since the early 1980s than it was previously. This shows you by education level the change in log real wage levels. We took some time to explain this to the candidates. But you can think of this as kind of percentage changes in wages over this period. And since the early 1980s, the higher education groups have seen increases in real earnings. This shows you men. And the least educated high school dropouts have seen pretty remarkable decline in their real earnings. If you look at high school dropout men, their earnings after adjusting for inflation fell by about 20% from the early 80s to the early 90s. That's begun to reverse since the beginning of the 90s, but they're still earning considerably less than they were in the early 1980s. And this figure shows you the same set of results for women. And the overall picture is brighter for women. Earnings growth has been stronger for women at all levels of education. But even among women, you see much faster growth in earnings for those who have a higher level of education. The candidates were very interested in job growth. This was before the unemployment rate started to tick up and job growth turned negative. And job growth in the U.S. has been relatively steady over this whole period, but it's been much more concentrated in higher skilled jobs. This is from a study by David Otter, Frank Levy, and Richard Murnane, where they broke down jobs into whether they require routine skills, non-routine skills, manual skills. And what seems to have grown the most are non-routine interactive skills, analytical skills, routine manual skills, routine cognitive skills, the types of things that can be done by machinery or by computers. There we've seen a decline in employment. Here's another piece of the puzzle, and I think an important one. This shows you average educational attainment by year of birth, and going back to people who were born in the late 1870s. And you can see that the U.S. had very strong increase, very steady increase in educational attainment all the way through the cohort born in the early 1950s, and then you see a different trend, much slower growth in educational attainment, and that's coming about primarily in the post-high school years. That's where we've seen a slowdown in the growth of education. This shows you the ratio of earnings of blacks to whites, and you see a couple of things in this graph. One is, beginning with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the mid-1960s, especially for men, you see a narrowing in the black-white wage gap. And if you do an analysis, looking by region, looking more carefully year by year, what you see is kind of a discrete break, beginning with the implementation of the Civil Rights Act. And then since the late 1970s, early 1980s, much more stagnant growth in earnings for blacks relative to whites. For women, there's been something of a decline. Black women's earnings were fairly close to parity with white women's earnings in the late 1970s. Now they're further behind. And for black men, their earnings have kind of gradually approached those of white men, although they're still 20% behind for the median African-American worker. So what is the causes of these trends? Why has inequality increased, and why more recently are we seeing more polarization between the very bottom and the very top? I think the simplest explanation, and the one that is most consistent with the facts, is that there's been a race between the skills of the workforce and the technological demands of employers, and so far technology has been winning. Now, I don't think this is the only explanation. I do think that if you were to poll economists, it would be the one that would get the most weight. In fact, I can tell you I did such a poll once, and this did get the most weight. So essentially, the argument is that there's been technological change, fairly steady technological change, in the post-war period, but perhaps accelerating in the 1980s with the spread of computers and information technology, which has increased the demand for more highly skilled workers and made much of the work that less skilled workers do replaceable by capital. And at the same time, the improvement in the skills of the workforce has slowed down. Now, we've continued to have increases in average education, increases in on-the-job training, but at a slower rate than what we had seen historically. Now, one of the reasons why I think a majority of economists would point to these factors is, if you look at what's happened to employment, at the same time that wages of college-educated workers have increased, their employment has increased as well. If you look at the sectors which have been growing most rapidly, they tend to be those that employ more skilled workers. If you look at the sectors where technology has changed most rapidly, and in particular the adoption of computer technology, those are sectors that seem to have increased their demand for skilled workers. So the idea is that the increase in demand for more highly skilled workers has outpaced the increase in supply of those workers. Now, I don't think that's the only factor, and in fact, I think that has some difficulty accounting for the trends over the whole time period that I showed you. Other factors have played a role as well. I would highlight the decline in unions. Union membership has declined from about 35% of the private sector workforce in the mid-1950s to most recently below 8% of the private sector. This trend, I think, matters a lot more for men than it does for women because men tended to be more highly unionized than women. Another factor is globalization. Surprisingly, however, I think economists have had trouble pinning the rise in inequality on globalization. And if you look at the late 1990s, when we had tremendous currency shocks, you had the Mexican peso crisis, and then you had the Asian currency crises. That's when the bottom actually did quite well. So it's very difficult, I think, to connect the decline in wages at the bottom with globalization. On the other hand, I think globalization can certainly matter more as we go forward. And in particular, I think some of the weakness in wages that we've seen in the middle class might be related to offshoring. And I suspect that trend will accelerate in the future. Another factor which seems to have mattered is the fall in the real value of the minimum wage. From 1981 until 1990, the minimum wage stayed constant in nominal terms. So in real terms, it declined. Excellent work by David Lee, who's on the faculty here at Princeton, has shown a pretty strong connection between the decline in the value of the minimum wage and the rise in inequality, the fall in earnings at the bottom. And that matters more for women because women are more likely to be paid the minimum wage or to have their wages in the range where it's affected by the minimum wage. And then finally, I would mention immigration, although I think immigration is probably the least important of these factors. The U.S. has seen a big increase in immigration since the early 1980s. However, what I think of as the most compelling studies trying to connect immigration with earnings finds relatively little effect of large increases in immigration on the earnings of natives. And I suspect that's because when immigrants come to the U.S., they also buy more U.S.-made products, more services, and so on, and that increases demand. But a factor which I think is on the list, but not very high on the list, is the rise in immigration. I should probably wrap up because I want to leave time for the other members of the panel. With the candidates, we also talked about policy options. That's my last slide. I won't show it to you, but I'm happy to talk about that if we have time in the discussion. Thanks.
You never know what color these things are going to be when you put them up on the board. Being a good Princetonian, I always have an orange-black background with black print, but as you can see on the screen, it turns out something entirely different. We all agree, I think, on the basic facts, and certainly the facts that Alan just laid out to you are very well established and widely accepted and pretty much beyond dispute. I want to present the way a sociologist looks at what's happened in the past several decades. One of the key points of the new field of economic sociology is that markets are not states of nature. Markets are very much human creations. For most of human history, most of the interactions between human beings, most of the exchanges between human beings have taken place outside of markets. It's only been in the last couple of 100 years that markets have risen to such a level of prominence and scale that now a majority of human interactions probably occur in the context of some kind of market or another. Markets were invented and created and propagated because they're very good at distributing goods and services in a very effective way and have produced long-term accumulations of wealth, spectacular accumulations of wealth. Nonetheless, markets are defined by very specific sets of political arrangements. They're defined by institutions. They're defined by infrastructures. The infrastructures and institutions can be social. They can be political. They can be economic. And they can be physical, an actual physical infrastructure. And they are usually arranged through a combination of public and private interactions. Public and private interactions create the necessary infrastructure and institutions to allow markets to occur. Just simple examples. You need a state to guarantee property rights. You need a state to create a stable currency. You need a state to specify contracts and the rights and obligations on people on either side of the contracts. All these things are determined by government. So markets don't exist in the absence of government. Markets can only exist in the presence of accepted government. And the thing to understand about what's happened in the past 3 or 4 decades is that we have shifted political economy from a set of rules and regulations that managed markets in a fairly balanced way that gave more say, more power in the markets, more influence in the markets to consumers and to wage earners than to owners of capital and to professionals. And starting in the mid-1970s, we changed the rules of the political game. Actually, I'll take it clear back to 1947 when the rules of the political game began to change. So first, let me talk about the political economy of poverty, how the world has changed for workers and the poor. This shows the level of unionization in the United States. I think you can see fairly clearly the effect of the passage of the National Labor Relations Act. And that led to an immediate and rapid increase in levels of unionization. And then the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed right about here, and it led to another burst of unionization, producing these high levels, about just under 35%, that Alan had mentioned earlier. So what changed here was not any desire on the part of workers to be unionized. What changed was the rules under which they're allowed to organize themselves, and the role of the state in guaranteeing the rights of workers to organize themselves. So this was immensely successful, and it was brought about after a period during the 1920s of dominance by business owners and professionals, by a reorientation of the political system that brought into a kind of shaky coalition economic populists from the South, working class from the North, liberal from the Northeast, and progressives in the West, to rewrite the rules of the political economy in a way that favored labor over capital. And the result was a spectacular increase in unionization, which stalls out right about 1947 with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act. What happened here? What happened here was this represents pretty much the successful and high levels of unionization of working classes in the North. The only place for unions to expand was by beginning to organize in the South. And when unions began to experience incipient successes in unionizing black workers in factories, in fields, and in the service sector in the South, what happened was the Southern bloc of the New Deal coalition bolted and formed a new alliance with business-oriented Republicans to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act in specific ways that made it much more difficult to unionize. The Taft-Hartley Act, of which Harry Truman vetoed, calling it a slave labor bill, but which passed over his veto in a coalition between Republicans and Southern Democrats, the first harbinger of a realignment that was later to take form and produce an even more profound change, outlawed the closed shop, that is, outlawed making union membership and paying dues a condition of employment, outlawed secondary labor actions so that it prevented labor unions from organizing boycotts or strikes against firms who did business with a firm that was the subject of a strike action. It granted new powers to the federal government to enforce injunctions against strikes, And it created new authority to impose an 80-day cooling-off period, requiring the strike to end for at least 80 days. And it also authorized the federal authorities to investigate unions for unfair organizing practices, and authorized businesses to sue unions for damages if there was a finding that they'd done something unfair in organizing the unions. So you can see it shifted the power deliberately away from workers towards employers, and the reason this happened against the economic interests of most people in the United States was because of the issue of race. Like most things in this country, it falls upon, it capsizes on the shoals of race. This basically stopped the growth, which had been spectacular, and led to a period of more or less stability. But as you can see, after a decline, there was another turnaround, and they started to organize again and started to regroup and make new tactics to enter into the South and begin to organize minority workers. And this prompted in 1959 the passage of the Landrum-Griffin Act, which once again rewrote the political economy against workers and towards business owners and professionals. This was the key amendment to the law here was it once again amended the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act to permit non-union workers to vote in decertification strikes. So that a union goes on strike, workers leave the plant, the employer now brings in scab labor, fills the plant with scab labor, and then has them vote along with the union. As long as he hires more scab labor than there were unions that quit, he can decertify the union and the strike's over. Why? Because the Southern delegates could not face the prospect of black people unionizing in the United States. As what we've seen then is incredible weakness in American unions compared to our brethren or our partners in the OECD. Unionization levels never reached the levels they did in Europe, and they have declined much more substantially than they ever did in Europe. And race was the tool that allowed this to happen. So here you see a steady decline in the frequency of successful union elections, steady decline in the frequency of strikes, and research by a lot of labor economists, many of whom we've taught here, show that frequency of strikes and union elections has a big effect in promoting, has a big positive effect on wages. Employers do respond to strikes and the threat of strikes. One thing that Alan also mentioned was the change in the real value of the minimum wage. So you can see Truman gets reelected here, there's an increase, and through the area of good feeling and through the Eisenhower administration, there was a consensus, as Nolan McCarty has shown, period of consensus, which begins to break down right in conjunction with the Civil Rights Movement. The height of the Civil Rights Movement, the last major piece of civil rights legislation was the Fair Housing Act, and this was the high water mark of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which was more than an anti-poverty program. It was a deliberate attempt to de-racialize a heavily racialized New Deal. All the programs in the New Deal had been racialized by the need of the Southern delegation to preserve white privilege in the South. So every piece of New Deal legislation was structured so as to substantially exclude black coverage and black participation. This is well covered in a new book by Ira Katz Nelson called When Affirmative Action Was White. So it reached a high point here, real value of about $9 an hour and $2,002. Then Nixon comes into power. He falls apart in Watergate, stabilizes, and then here's when Reagan comes into power. And then Clinton, Bush and Clinton, and then steady down. This gives you a little better look. This is the proportion, how, the extent to which a single worker working at the minimum wage, legal minimum wage, the degree to which they could reach the poverty line for a family of four. So you see that working at minimum wages never allowed a worker to raise a family above poverty in the United States. The highest came at the end of the Johnson administration, where it reached about 94%. Since then, it's been steadily down, and you can see the timing. Declines, Republican, kind of stabilized, huge decline here, recovers, then during the Clinton administration, goes down, but comes up in the second term, and then straight down from there. You can see a similar restructuring of the political economy and basic social spending. So this is spending on our unemployment benefits per unemployed worker in constant dollars. See, it continued to rise as a legacy of the Great Society, and then fell, stabilized under Carter, fell, came back up under Clinton, and then languished. Similar pattern for public spending on social services for the poor. Again, constant dollars, per capita terms, relative to the number of poor people. And this is percentage of poor families receiving federal transfers, AFDC or TANF from the federal government. And here again, although most people don't realize it, race comes to play a huge role. As I said, the entire New Deal was deliberately racialized to prevent black Americans from coverage. And what this meant in terms of the Social Security Act, which authorized AFDC, was that it delegated to the states. It set requirements and the eligibility criteria, but delegated to the states the specifics of the eligibility and the actual administration of the program. And then had very little oversight. What this meant was, basically they allowed the South to systematically exclude African Americans. It delegated the authority to southern states to exclude African Americans, and this pattern was, because it was allowed under federal law, substantially replicated in northern cities as well. So tiny fractions of African American women who were eligible for AFDC coverage actually received it prior to 1960. Kennedy administrations, Johnson administration, in the context of this new passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, suddenly litigants had a tool to force state authorities to honor the civil rights, the social rights that have been embedded into social welfare law. And a group organized it, the National Welfare Rights Organization, organized and began suing states, forcing them to cover women who were eligible but happened to be black. The welfare rolls surged. And it was heavily driven by dramatic increases in black coverage. Well, this is when Ronald Reagan invented the metaphor of the welfare queen and launched a full-scale attack on American social welfare that stopped first under in the 1970s, under Nixon, held for a while under Carter, and then under Reagan, declined, stabilized, and then the coup de grace was the passage of the, what's it called, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, when the welfare rolls plummeted. They plummeted because suddenly there were term limits put on eligibility. And this occurred, as Alan has already pointed out, in the context of a remarkably robust growth in the American labor market. So during this period, there were actually jobs for people to go into, and the wages at the bottom end of the distribution were rising. Associated with the drop in welfare transfers is the elimination of access to food stamps. And in many cases, for some people, the government, federal government, is the employer of last resort. And what we've seen is the savaging of federal employment under the Bush administration. This is a story that's received very little attention. What has happened is that federal employment, federal government functions, things that we pay for as taxpayers, that we want our government to do for us, has been outsourced. So if you go to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, you've got a dramatically reduced number of employees whose job now basically is to manage half-assed contractors telling them how to do their job because they have no clue. And as a result, we're paying more to get the job done at a lower level of expertise, but all the money is not going into the public sector, it's going into the private sector. And I'm surprised our friend Paul Krugman maybe has written about this and I missed it, but this seems to be a story. Look at, I mean, it's just unprecedented what happened in Washington.
There's a Wilson School Commission to make recommendations.
Good.
On public service, which is well aware of that.
I'm very, very pleased to hear it.
Okay.
So, and then what's happened to consumers is a dramatic increase in consumer debt. So this is dollars, real dollars of debt per person. 1945 increases, kind of stabilizes during the 60s, takes off in the 80s, stabilizes a bit, and then skyrockets. So we're at unprecedented levels of consumer debt per society. How does this look for the other side of the coin, the political economy of affluence? Well, first thing we can look at is interest rates. So this is the overall interest rates in the economy. This is credit card interest rates. And you can see that they used to be fairly close, but the gap between them has widened and widened. So as more Americans have gone into debt, largely credit card consumer debt, the spread between what the banks pay in interest to borrow the money that they can in turn loan out and what consumers actually pay has gone dramatically up. As the debt indebtedness has gone up and the interest rates have gone up and the profits have gone up, Congress also rewrote bankruptcy law to make it much more difficult for individuals to file bankruptcy. Then, of course, there's the tax rates. These show statutory top tax rates on income and capital gains. There's a huge increase to pay for the First World War, which is basically rescinded and kept at very low levels during the 1920s. Roosevelt comes to power in 1932 and instantly raises the top tax rates, and so the top marginal rate exceeds 90% for much of this period. During falling income inequality, tax rates were actually very high, and even though the capital gains tax rates stayed fairly low. Then in the 1970s, to pay for the war in Vietnam, Johnson, after Kennedy gave this tax cut here, Johnson raised the top rate a bit to pay for the war, but that wasn't very popular, so he raised capital gains. Reagan comes in 1980, cuts rate on capital gains dramatically in 2 phases, cuts rates of taxes on top incomes to historically very low rates. This is the effective tax rate, the average tax rate paid by people making $20,000, $200,000, and $2 million in income. So you can see that there was a big gap up until the Reagan-Bush years. People who earned a lot more money paid a higher tax rate. After Reagan and Bush era, it narrowed dramatically. And this is what Bill Clinton was crucified for, this little bump up here, which is nothing compared to the cut here, and barely affected the middle income earners and low income earners. It's just an increase in the very wealthiest. And then since Bush has come to power, that's decreased as well. And we're now at historically quite low differentials. So basically progressivity in the American tax code has been eliminated. So my final point is that American inequality is not something that just happened. It resulted from a series of deliberate political decisions that were made in Congress and in the public arena to rewrite the rules of competition against the interests of workers and consumers and regular people and in favor of the interests of the wealthy, the powerful, and the owners. And to show that it's not simply something that happens, let's compare before tax and after tax inequality across selected OECD countries. So you can see that pre-tax Gini coefficients, that's a standard index of inequality, the income inequality kind of produced by the raw market before government redistribution It's actually greater in Belgium and France. It's actually remarkably high in Sweden and the Netherlands, on a par with the levels in the United States and Australia and Britain. About in Gini here, 0.45. Sweden's 0.44. It's even greater is 0.5 and 0.49 in France. The difference is our tax system and the redistributive mechanisms that are in place. In the United States, we have the highest post-tax level of inequality, and followed by the UK, followed by Australia, and then Canada, Switzerland, and then the rest, most of the rest of the OECD is much, much lower. Now, you can't explain these differences here in after-tax income, these cross-national differences, in terms of technology shifts, changing returns to education, globalization. We're all competing in the same global economy. We're all competing under the same technological regime. The difference here is that we have chosen to arrange a political economy that maximizes inequality in the United States. And that has been a deliberate set of decisions that we began to take in 1947, accelerated after the 1960s, and honed to a fine art during the first decade of the new century. Largely enabled, against the economic interests of the vast majority of Americans, because of the issue of race. Was the hook, the tool, the divide that conservative business people who never liked this, the progressivity of the New Deal, were able to systematically, in 30 years, dismantle most of that political economy. So what's the matter with Kansas? Kansas doesn't like African Americans, doesn't want them cut in on the benefits of the contemporary political economy, doesn't want them to benefit from the American welfare system. It is race that has enabled conservative elements in the United States to produce vastly more unequal system than other countries in the developed world. It's all. All this is laid out in the book.
Okay, now for something very different. First of all, I bring only words to you. Second, I'm going to talk to you about a very specific form of inequality and give you a little bit of the flavor, of how inequality feels on the ground. There's an ironic injustice of our prosperous era that people, I'm going to talk to you just to warn you about the inequality of care work. And one of the injustices is that people who provide life-enhancing services for a living generally receive inferior compensation or none at all for their efforts. Of course, a minority of professional caregivers, such as physicians and dentists, have organized their professions so that they mostly prosper from their work. But even when it comes to medical attention, unpaid family members and poorly paid household workers provide the bulk of the actual labor with trivial compensation as compared to their professional cousins. And when it comes to other forms of care, such as feeding, clothing, babysitting, and emotional sustenance, the discrepancy grows even larger. People who deliver such caring services form a large and largely unrecognized category of unequal workers. In fact, a friend of mine is currently caring for his ailing mother, and in a break during that care, just 2 days ago, he emailed me and he said, I have become so impressed, deeply impressed with caregivers, home health aides and nurses in the nursing home. They need such patience and skill. It is extremely hard work. Their low wages, he wrote me, is just a scandal. And indeed, the first American study that focused on the relative pay of care work documents a significant, what they call, wage penalty for face-to-face service providers, such as health care aides, teachers, counselors, and child care workers. And there was a recent article in the American Prospect that reports, for example, that 2.5 million adults who are paid to care for children are among the lowest earners in the United States. The average annual income of workers in child care centers was just more than $18,000 in 2004. The article reports $35,000 less than flight attendants. And let me add, even some $20,000 less than zookeepers. And although both men and women are involved in care work, and they both pay this penalty, we know that women do so more often since they're more likely to be involved in care work. This inequality of care seldom or usually does not make headlines. It certainly has not been a hot issue in the current presidential debates. I have not been asked to talk about this to the presidential candidates. And in fact, Gail Collins, and you may have seen her column in a relatively recent New York Times op-ed, and this is what she wrote. It's absolutely nuts that it's not a topic for discussion or even election year pandering. The Democratic candidates for president happily come together to tell organized labor about their unquenchable desire to have a union member as Secretary of Labor. The Republican candidates, she writes, flock to assure the National Rifle Association about their dedication to Americans' constitutional right to carry concealed weapons in churches. But you do not see anybody racing off to romance child care advocates. And let me briefly take, and I will only speak to you about 10, but by now 8 more minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Briefly, the case of paid family care providers, who constitute a very large group of child care workers in the United States. Family daycare providers, as you may know, turn their homes into commercial work settings, attending unrelated children for a fee. And the providers of daycare at home are among the most poorly paid workers in the United States. And though, of course, intermittent stories of abuse show up in the daily newspapers, on the whole, those providers devote themselves to the children's welfare as they piece together precarious incomes. And the available research underlines the problem. And let me again give you a couple of examples. A Washington State study of these child care workers told Mary Tuominen, the investigator, of their affectionate relationships to the children they were paid to care for. The relationship to parents was more ambivalent. On the one hand, the workers complained about parents exploiting their services by arriving late to pick up their children without paying overtime for the extra hours of work. On the other hand, child carers often adjusted their fees to accommodate a parent's financial situation. One example, Ann Burns, herself subsisting below the poverty level, explained why. In the case of one boy, she had reduced by half her monthly rates from $300 to $150 without cutting her hours of care. She said Dominic's mom is trying to move, and she's trying to sell all the furniture and trying to get all the bills paid before she leaves, so I could not. But setting prices was not the chief source of the care providers' conflict. Instead, the women were especially upset at the parents' disregard or disrespect for their underpaid efforts. In another 1990 Vermont study by Margaret Nelson, one respondent complained against a mother who, quote, would keep track of how much, and pay me just so much, and that hurt me because I thought, here I'm giving so much, how can she be so cheap with me? And also parents picking up children late caused trouble. That arriving late for the children's return home without paying extra caused a triple harm of signaling disregard for the care worker, keeping the care worker from other tasks, and costing the care worker money. Now, obviously, home child care providers are not alone. A wide variety of workers that care for children, the elderly, and the ill, including nannies, child care aides, health aides, foster parents, and practical nurses, share a similar situation. And what is intriguing is that this inequality of care persists even as the demand for care expands significantly. With the aging of the baby boom generation, and as most mothers in the United States participate in paid work, the care of children, the elderly, the ill, is becoming increasingly a pressing concern. What's more, development of health management organizations with the aging of the American population have combined to create an increasing burden of health care on households. Home health care now often demands, and some of you may know this unfortunately already, the management of complex care technologies, intravenous tubes, oxygen masks that are often sent home with a patient. Now there's a glimmer of hope that arises in the union organizing efforts that have recently occurred among home-based child care providers, an exception to the union trends that we've heard before. For example, in New York last October, in what the New York Times called the largest successful organizing drive in New York City in half a century, 28,000 child care providers joined the City Teachers Union. Tammy Miller, who takes care of 6 children at her home near Prospect Park in Brooklyn, told the reporter, unionizing is the only hope that we have as child care providers to make our voice heard and to get the respect that we deserve. That includes better pay, health insurance, and paid vacations. Nevertheless, for the foreseeable future, the providers of paid care will continue to lack the sort of leverage enjoyed by physicians, dentists, and other well-organized professionals. To the detriment of the children involved, because of this, turnover is high, because child care workers so often exit into higher wage opportunities as soon as they open up. The same happens with nurses. And even more obviously, the economic value of household care escapes notice for the ironic reason that it seems so natural. Worse yet, even within households, and we've talked of inequality of households and each other, but within households, the mostly female providers of unpaid care generally find themselves economically disadvantaged precisely because they are not bringing in outside wages that would give them leverage in household relations. In case it's not obvious, all of this, in all of this, women and children have been the great losers. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We have an awful lot to think about. I want to make a quick comment. I won't make another speech as well. There's one aspect that didn't really get mentioned directly that I think is worth noting here, and that's the legal part of all of this. The place to start is that if you think all the way back to the American Revolution, ours was a revolution that was fought for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which meant property. It wasn't a revolution fought for liberté, égalité, fraternité. And égalité, equality, has never been in itself a legal value in our constitutional system. And in fact, and I'll give you a speech about that, but if you go to particularly the material that Doug is talking about, the great legislative interventions that come starting in 1935 with the Wagner Labor Act are things that Congress could do without constitutional change. The great changes come, though, after 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education, when equal protection of the law, not equality, becomes more of a reality in American constitutional law. And the declines that Doug is talking about, and really they're all talking about, are also correlated to something that's not mentioned here, and that is the end of the Warren Court and the coming of the Berger Court, and the shutting down of the opening up of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, so that the kinds of suits that Doug is talking about in the name of equality were limited because they no longer had the kind of constitutional basis that they had for a relatively brief period in our time. And the result of that is that if one wants to pursue change in an egalitarian direction in the society, it needs to come through political and social action. It's not going to come through the courts in the way that it did in the 1960s. I just want to put that on the table as another factor that's worth thinking about. So if you weren't depressed enough when you looked at the photographs, I hope you are now. And let me open it up for questions. And if you have a question, would you identify yourself and address a particular speaker if you'd like to? Please.
My name is Gerald Boswell, and it's a continuation of your constitutional context, and it's directed to Doug. My question really is, all of your charts had to do with the federal system and with the increase of the Berger Court moving into Rehnquist. We saw the change in federalism so that the federal government was shifting back onto the states responsibilities that traditionally had been the federal government and changing of block grants. I was wondering, has any studies been done that would parallel what you've done with the federal statistics into various states?
Well, I think the period from 1932 to 1972 is really the aberration. The country was set up constitutionally to prevent a concentration of federal power, to delegate immense powers to the states, largely because a majority of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were slaveholders, and they didn't want to create a federal entity that might abrogate slavery in the several states. Fought a civil war over that issue, and had a brief period of forward movement under Reconstruction, which came to an end constitutionally in 1876, came to end politically in 1876, with the Tilden Hayes election, where Hayes agreed to pull federal troops out of the South in return for getting some Southern delegates to be elected president. And then constitutionally, with the Plessy decision in 1893, a new order of racial subordination was created that allowed the states not to have slavery, but to set up sharecropping systems, to set up Jim Crow legislation, to set up a legalized, segregated society. What changed then was the coming together of federal powers again in 1932. But Franklin Roosevelt was only able to pull this off because he had the support of the Southern Democratic congressional delegation. And they only supported the economic populism as long as it was clear that blacks would not be enfranchised. What brought the whole thing down was when Lyndon Johnson insisted not only on legally ending Jim Crow in the South, and insisted in the 1964 Civil Rights Act of actually enforcing this 54 Warren Court decision. Not only did he do those things, but he insisted on deracializing the entire New Deal. And that required immense concentrations of power, Great Society, model cities, huge increases in block grants, and that, in the context of civil rights and the immense accretions of power to minorities in the poor, brought the counter-revolution, which led to a new period of devolution of powers back to the states and the dismantling of federal authority. That's how I read the situation.
Alan?
I just wanted to comment. There's much in what Doug said that I agree with, and there's a lot that I disagree with. I think pinning everything on race is just not the correct explanation for the trends in inequality, particularly driven by the labor market that we've seen since the late 1970s. For one thing, how can you explain the same trends in the UK? How can you explain the same trends when it comes to relative earnings of well-educated versus less educated workers around the world? Most of Europe, you see rising inequality, especially with earnings, although mediated by the fact that you do have differences in institutions. I think what Doug said about the way you organize a market certainly does matter. No question about federalism, I think it's a much more nuanced picture. So Doug showed you some trends with unemployment benefits, which are right. But unemployment benefits are actually quite a small program. Compare what's spent on unemployment benefits to the earned income tax credit. So when we changed the safety net, we made it much more connected with work. The earned income tax credit is a national program, expanded greatly under Reagan and then under Clinton. So that's been more centralized. Some other programs, some of the other institutional changes, there have been big differences across states. So the minimum wage is a good example. When you have a period like in the 1980s when the federal minimum wage didn't increase, the states step in, and a number of states raised their minimum wages, including New Jersey in the early 1990s. And you do see the minimum wage mattering there for inequality. So I think it's right that that's part of the story, but I think it's just a small part of the story. Then the last part, if the race explanation is right, it's kind of hard to explain the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the improvement in the economic position of African Americans rather discreetly in the mid-'60s, beginning in the mid-'60s. And I would even argue continuing. I mean, if you look at the trends in the rise in inequality in the 80s, you would have predicted African Americans would have fallen much, much further behind than they actually fell behind because they were very much swimming upstream, given that African Americans tend to be in less skilled jobs, lower paid jobs, and those are the jobs that did the worst. There has been, this is the only part maybe that answers your question, there has been research on the state fair employment practice laws, a lot of it done by Stan's former colleagues at Chicago, which found kind of what you find from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that the states that were first to pass fair employment practice laws did have a relative improvement in the economic positions of African Americans.
Good. Viviana, do you?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Yeah.
Ignacio Walker, I'm a professor here at Princeton University. I'm trying to understand, I look to this from abroad, but it's a fascinating discussion. And I have two questions to Professors Massey and Krueger. The first question, it may sound like naive, but it's not. It's really trying to understand rather than taking sides between Republicans and Democrats. My first question is, why is it that so many people have voted Republicans in the last 28 years? In this country? Because it would seem that somehow the electoral majority has been voting against its own interests in terms of the social and economic majority. How is that to be explained? I need an explanation. And the second question, which perhaps has something to do with that, to what extent, Doc, many of the figures that both of you have given to us today, more than related to a deliberate political decision to take things in a certain course, have something to do with very deep structural changes in the economy, the world economy, from an industrial to a post-industrial setting, to industries to services, that somehow, especially in the era of globalization, leave less margin of maneuver in terms of public policies, and thus, for example, the difference between Clinton and Bush will not be so big in certain states. Those are the two questions.
Well, I'm not qualified to comment on the politics. I will tell you, I don't think people tend to vote their economic interest. And study after study finds you ask public opinion polls about where people stand on certain issues, and it doesn't really line up with their economic interest. I think, as an economist, I wouldn't mind if they voted their economic interest, but I think people might have a broader view. We tend to think of them as narrowly self-interested in the positions they take, and maybe they do what they think is better for the country. Now, they might be misguided about what's better for the country, but I think study after study has found, Alan Blander and I have a paper in the Brookings papers where we tried to model public opinion on a range of issues. Even the elderly were not more supportive for including prescription drugs in Medicare, where you would have thought it was in their economic interest. I also think, and I also don't think it's right when you say that people have been voting for Republicans. I mean, most of this period, Congress was controlled by Democrats, except for 12 years, except for since the Greenwich Revolution in '94 until recently. Most of that period was controlled by Democrats. I think American voters are fairly pragmatic, and I don't think that they're ideological. And to some extent, I think that they do like divided government. Anyway, that's my rough ideas. The second question you raised is a good one, and the economic forces shape the institutions and the rules of the game as well. So you could look at, for example, the trend in unionization, where unionization started to decline much too soon to explain the rise in inequality, which began in the late 70s. Judge's chart showed that union rate was falling in the late 1950s. It's hard to explain why inequality didn't jump up in the 1960s. In fact, it was just the opposite. My own personal view about why unions have declined is not so much because economic pressures have made it harder for workers to unionize or international competition or changes. Even the large changes that you mentioned in the movement from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, unionization declined within all sectors. It wasn't just concentrated, the decline wasn't just concentrated in manufacturing. My own sense is that the union leadership stopped providing the kinds of services that workers wanted, especially women workers. And a major reason is not the decline in the union win rate for the decline in unions, but there are just fewer union organizing drives. And for some reason, I have my hypothesis, unions made organizing a lower priority. Now, one can argue about why that happened, but that's my take on it. And if you ask about voting, would workers vote for a union? There's been a decline in that. If an election were held, would you vote for a union? That's declined. And I think some of the institutional changes, which we sort of take as almost as given, are to some extent dictated by the economic forces. So that's why I think it's a bit difficult to kind of take the institutions as exogenous and say this is what's caused things to change. Even if you take the last chart that Doug showed from Tim's meeting, which showed the Gini coefficients before tax and after tax. Well, one of the first things you learn in economics is that the person who pays the tax doesn't necessarily bear the burden of the tax. There's tax shifting. And if you raise the tax on some group, that could cause their wage to go up. So to take the tax rates as if they don't have any effect on the distribution of earnings, I think is just wrong. Anyway, I think that the economic forces do shape the policies to some extent. And I think that there are some forces in the political realm that cause the minimum wage, for example, to go up or down, or other policies to change, which are independent of what was going on in the economy, and then you can trace through the influence of those policies on the economy as well.
I think one of the interesting things for social scientists is the degree to which people make decisions that are not in their self-interest, and that are not following a rational expectations model. And some people on this faculty at Princeton, not me, are doing some of the most interesting work here. One of our colleagues in the Woodrow School, Alex Todorov. It depends on how you look and whether you look into somebody's face and you feel like you can trust them. So he's done a study where he's got all these pictures, like high school yearbook pictures and whatnot, from all these candidates from races all over the country. And he knows from the data who won the race, and he just flashes up the picture and very briefly exposes and say, who would you vote for? And that has huge predictive validity for who wins the election. And that's, it's not a rational calculation. It's who you thought you could feel most comfortable with and trust by looking at their face. The other person who's done some of the most interesting public opinion work is Larry Bartels, and so if he wants to answer that question, I'll leave it to him. But people don't make decisions entirely rationally. And one thing I will add, if you read new books like The Political Brain, where you're starting to take insights from cognitive neuroscience and look at how people actually do make decisions, the kind of political establishment has gotten very skilled at manipulating people's emotional brains to override their rational brains. And that's a lot of what political advertising seeks to do, in the same way that product advertising seeks to do. They seek to establish an affective orientation towards a candidate and get people to vote on the basis of that affective orientation towards the candidate. Then in terms of the global economy and what's going on, the global economy, like the national economy, is based on rules and institutions. And the rules and institutions have been very skewed towards a relatively narrow set of actors. So the outcomes, not surprisingly, benefit a relatively narrow set of actors. So there aren't a lot of protections for labor provisions built into the WTO. And the enforcement mechanisms for labor standards across countries are very weak. So the ILO is very weak compared to the WTO. In a sense, we've chosen as a global political economy to write rules that benefit certain economic actors at the expense of other economic actors. This was certainly the case in Latin America, as we discussed earlier.
No, all I am curious about is I agree, of course, completely in the non-rational or different forms of rationality in understanding who we decide to vote. But I wasn't sure that that was, in fact, you didn't address the question to me, but it didn't sound that that was your first question of an explanation of the choice of how we decide how to vote, but for the extent of conservative voting in the United States. And I'm actually curious in your own response to that.
I mean, the question is,
It seemed to me that you had in mind something.
Yeah, it may sound like naive or theoretical, but it is not, because, these 28 years, let's talk about the presidents, Reagan's and the Bush eras and so on, Clinton was in between there. But, it would seem that electoral majority, which voted Republican, which voted Bush or Reagan or whatever, is voting against its own economic interests, in terms that the majority, economic and social majority, has been hurt by this shift, by this press. So I think you don't need further explanation.
Larry, do you want to say something about it?
Yeah, I think the most important pattern is that they're trying to vote in their economic interest, but they're not very good at it. So there's a strong relationship between how the economy is doing in the election year and whether the incumbent party gets reelected. You'd think that would be good for Democrats because historically through this period, the real income growth among middle-class people has been about twice as strong under Democratic presidents as it has been under Republican presidents. And the real income growth for working poor people has been about 6 times as great under Democratic presidents as it has under Republican presidents, except in presidential election years when Republicans do better for everybody across the income spectrum than Democrats do. And so the myopia of people focusing on how things are at the time of the election rather than the entire record of the incumbent administration makes about a 3 percentage point difference in the average vote over this half century. The Republican average margin happens to be about 3 percentage points. And so the difference between how the Republicans and Democrats have done is entirely accounted for by that. Then there's another 3% or so that has to do with the fact that they focus mostly on how the economy is going for rich people. So the votes of rich people are sensitive to how the economy is going for rich people. The votes of middle-class people are sensitive to how the economy is going for rich people. And the votes of poor people are sensitive to how the economy is going for rich people. And the economy goes better for rich people in presidential years under Republicans. So that's about another 3 percentage points. And then there's a big difference in the amount of money that they spend on their campaigns. That's about another 3 percentage points. So you have an average Republican margin of about 3 percentage points, which would be an average Democratic margin of about 6 percentage points, absent those 3 historical biases.
Thank you. Please.
I'd be interested in hearing policy prescriptions and how they take different forms, and I'm particularly interested in hearing Professor Zelizer's ideas about care work.
Of policy perspectives on care work, that's pristine, challenging one. I see myself as the prescribing or identifying the problems and letting the people in this building find the solutions. That's why I'm in Wallace Hall, Wilson School. But I do think it's I don't want to come out completely. Of course, there are really daunting obstacles to effective policy, as you yourself in your own work have considered. One of the interesting things, and this is going to the law, one of the most effective real legal solutions that I've been observing are not so much for the paid care workers, but for the costs with consequences for inequality of the unpaid caregiving. So that we have now, is particularly coming from Joan Williams and a series of other feminist lawyers, but particularly from Joan Williams, challenging in court discrimination against both male and female caregivers who will be fired because they have a sick child or because they have to take care of an elderly parent. And what is remarkable is that some of, she seems to be, well, not her directly, but people using these arguments are seeming, are gaining. And so that policies are changing in that respect. And the pattern, and I don't, and I would welcome any information on experts in unionization, this interesting pattern, and I've heard Dorothy Sue-Cobble, who's a historian, has been documenting some increase in the unionization of some of the paid caregivers. We face, and let me just give just a little insight into this, we face very strong of what I have called hostile worlds thinking. We face the problematic that good care has been equated with low pay, so that somehow if you don't earn a lot, you are providing superior caregiving. And this is a very pervasive thought, and it has injured the income of paid caregivers. What we are discovering with actual research, of which there had been very little up to now, research that looks on the ground at these paid caregivers, is that you can love very nicely and be paid well at the same time. And that in fact, by continuing this pattern of low pay, as I said, and I would want to emphasize again, you're losing the most talented caregivers who will exit into better paid jobs, and you're in fact remaining with the less skilled who don't have access to those other jobs.
And to what extent does gender have to do with this?
Well, gender has to do with this dramatically because it has been, it is, and it has been women who have tended, and again, we don't want to go into a history of gender now, but certainly gender as a central form of inequality is important, and women have been the caregivers. But we do have issues of of inequality for male caregivers, even though they will be in the minority.
Sure. Okay. Yes, please.
I guess just to what are some of the public policy options that can relieve inequality, and what do you think possibly if there's a Democratic administration like that?
Let me say that, just speaking for myself, the set of policies I would recommend closely looking at is number one, tax, which I think whoever that expresses is going to look at closely, whichever party. Then I think there's a fair amount of consensus around education reform, probably independent of the economics, but I think if you draw a connection between some of the trends that we've seen in education, that leads naturally to thinking about ways of improving K-12 education. I think most importantly, increasing access to post-high school education, and also training programs. One of the things that I had proposed when I met with both of the candidates was expanding the earned income tax credit. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of support, I think, in the public for the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit is a lot more generous if you have dependents. And what I have proposed is that the group that has the most difficulty in the labor market are people leaving high school. Their wages are low, they're kind of directionless. I think their attachment to the labor force is weak, in part because their pay is so low. So what I propose is for the first 5 years of someone's career, you can do this in different ways, start at age 18, say when the person's left school, that's when the clock begins running. For the first 5 years, they would qualify for the earned income tax credit as if they had dependents. They'd get the full benefit. And that's something which I've been meaning to try to kind of flesh that out more, because I don't think it'd be particularly expensive, but I think it does go directly to a group which is a major social problem, major economic problem in the U.S. I would also consider ways of strengthening employee rights at work. And I think there's some stories that I shouldn't tell you about this task force. But, not just through traditional unions, there are other ways of if you have a union election and the union gets 49% of the votes, the workers get no representation at all. And you can imagine a system where you have some kind of works council which represents the workers' interest, maybe for grievances, if not for bargaining. Also, I think speeding up union elections, enforcing the protections that we have, which are not well enforced, to protect workers' rights during organizing drives. Another thing I would mention is infrastructure projects. And actually, when we met with Obama, which was end of July, beginning of August, what was striking to me was his instincts, because we talked about how the construction sector had done pretty well in the early 2000s. And he turned to Austin Goolsbee, who was his top economic advisor, and he said, so in year 2 of my administration, when we hit a recession, what do you recommend we do? And he was, I think he was leading us along to talk about infrastructure projects, which was, I think, extremely good timing. About 2 weeks later, the bridge in Minneapolis collapsed. And infrastructure is on the table now as part of the stimulus package, but the problem is infrastructure projects take a while to get going. Then the final thing I would say, which makes a fair amount of sense to me, if you think about what could be done for the middle class, I think the truth is, within the constraints in the political arena, there's not all that much. And if you look at the size of the Bush tax cuts and what was transferred from the middle class to the top 2% of income earners, it was much larger movement in income over the last 10 years than what we've seen because of the tax cuts. So even if you wiped out the tax cuts, you're reversing a small amount of the rise in inequality. Just to give you an idea of the size, kind of the scale of what I would call the problem. So to my mind, the practical thing that could be achieved is improvements in health insurance, universal health insurance coverage. And I have to say, I'm not terribly optimistic that that's going to happen. Even though both Democratic candidates are in favor of greatly expanding health insurance coverage, and John Edwards certainly was, and Obama would have a mandate for all children, and I think he would lead to substantial increases in coverage overall, and Hillary Clinton's bill certainly would do that. I don't think there's demand in the public for it, and I think this relates a little bit to people voting their interest, the way people perceive their interests. Then you throw in the interest groups, which by and large are not in favor of the healthcare industry. By and large is not going to be in favor of universal insurance. So I think it's much more likely there will be a major infrastructure initiative under the next president than there will be universal health insurance.
I would agree with all those policy directions. And add one more, and I think it is important, is immigration reform. Who are the healthcare workers? Who are the caring workers today? It's heavily immigrant labor force. And we have a very dysfunctional immigration system now where we have substantial demand for workers at both the high and the low end. And BLS projections show that one of the most explosive growth areas for labor demand is going to be at the low end in the healthcare sector. And yet we have increasingly restrictive immigration policy that has made it more difficult than ever to migrate legally into the United States if you're an unskilled worker. As a result, the economy's chugging along and the workers are there, but they're heavily in illegal status. 1/3 of all foreign-born people in the United States are now out of status. 1/2 of all Mexicans are out of status, Mexican-born people. And that constitutes 1/5 of all Mexican Americans. And this is also a tremendous barrier to movements towards greater unionization. It used to be labor unions were against immigrants. That's completely flipped now because most of the large unions see that the great potential for growth comes in unionizing these dependent sectors. And the labor unions should be actually behind immigration reform. So I think that immigration reform would go a long way towards ameliorating care work and to raising wages at the lower end of the wage distribution and to promoting higher levels of unionization and if you could bring these workers above and tax them and identify revenue streams, could help pay for health care in a fairly straightforward manner.
Yes. Well, we're out of time now, but before we thank people, I want to say that we're going to have a reception, so you haven't missed your chance to ask questions. So before we go outside to the reception and look at the images, thank our friend.
Yeah.